What do we learn from Josephus? From Josephus, we learned about the diversity of Judaism, and he frames Jewish diversity in terms of philosophies. That is, he uses a term that helps a broader audience to make sense of the varieties of Judaism. Just like Greeks may have many kinds of philosophy, he implies, so do Jews. And the term philosophies also gives a gravity and weight to Jewish diversity in Josephus's reading. Jewish practices and ways of thinking and believing are worthy of being called philosophical schools. In his Antiquities, he lists 4 philosophies. There are 3 that he indicates are long-standing ones. The first is the Pharisees. They live simply, he writes. They respect reason. They respect the old. They believe the soul is immortal and that free will reigns. They believe in the resurrection of the good and that the wicked will dwell in an everlasting prison. He says that many are convinced of their doctrine. The second philosophy he mentions are the Sadducees. They, he says, argue that souls die with their bodies, quite different from the Pharisees, and he says that very few accept their doctrines. He also says snidely that they act like Pharisees once they come into power, otherwise people wouldn't accept them. We get the sense that Josephus sides more with the Pharisees than the Sadducees. And third, he talks about the Essenes, who believe, like the Pharisees, in the immortality of the soul and the struggle for reward of the righteous. They do not participate in temple sacrifice, but they have purer rights of their own. Josephus writes that they love virtue and righteousness and that they hold all things in common. He talks about the fact that about 400 of them exist who have this lifestyle, who have no wives, no slaves. He gives them a really glowing description, and he says that they're like the Greeks in that they have the idea that bodies are corruptible but souls are immortal. Josephus has to mention a 4th philosophy, one that he doesn't like as much, and he says that Judas the Galilean was its author. He says that this group is attached to liberty. God is the only ruler and Lord, they argue, and they accept death and reject the idea that they should have to call anyone Lord other than their God. Josephus says that there are 4 sects. He argues that one of these 4 is not like the others, to quote from Sesame Street. The Galilean Judas, whose revolutionary ban was elevated to the status of a philosophy, is marginalized with one statement from Josephus, and I quote, "This man was a teacher of a peculiar sect of his own, and was not at all like the rest of their leaders." Josephus shows us, by talking about these 4 philosophies, how political resistance and theology were intertwined in the 1st century. In fact, he talks about Jewish martyrdom. To quote him, "And as for death, if it will be for their glory, they esteem it better than living always. And indeed, our war with the Romans gave abundant evidence what great souls they had in their trials, wherein, although they were tortured and distorted, burnt and torn to pieces, and went through all kinds of instruments of torment, that they might be forced either to blaspheme their legislator or to eat what was forbidden them, yet could they not be made to do either of them, no, nor once to flatter their tormentors, or to shed a tear. They smiled in their very pains, and laughed those to scorn who inflicted torments upon them, and resigned up their souls with great alacrity, as expecting to receive them again. For their doctrine is this, that bodies are corruptible, and that the matter they are made of is not permanent, but that the souls are immortal and continue forever." Josephus tells a story and helps us to picture a history of the varieties of Judaism in the ancient world. Paying close attention to what he says helps us to avoid a trap that's plagued scholars for a long time: the tendency to talk about Judaism in antiquity as if it's just one thing, as if it just looks one way. He also reminds us to avoid our tendency to talk about Christianity in antiquity as if it too were monolithic. As Josephus talks about these 4 Jewish philosophies, we may hear things that remind us of New Testament texts or about what we've heard that early Christianity looks like. Sharing all things in common, a value of the Essenes, is something mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, and Paul's call to share funds for a Jerusalem collection and his mentions of co-workers and co-strugglers certainly point to sharing and a striving for commonality. Belief in the immortality of the soul, which the Pharisees and Essenes share, Paul certainly talks about the idea of the mortal putting on immortality in 2 Corinthians. The idea of the resurrection, something Josephus mentions in connection to the Pharisaic sect. Paul's letters talk about Jesus' resurrection, And they talk about the resurrection of other believers, especially discussing the idea of the resurrection of the body at the end of 1 Corinthians. The idea of bravery before death and resistance to calling any human Lord. This too we associate with those who died in the Jesus movement and in early Christianity. We see a hint of multiple kinds of Jews, or Jews in Christ, at the beginning of Galatians. There, Paul insists that Galatians shouldn't be following another gospel. They shouldn't be led astray by other Jews. As we read along, we realize that Paul's trying to carve out a place for his calling, for his apocalypse or vision of Christ, in the midst of other Jews who are also taking that message out and explaining how Gentiles or non-Jews may become God's people. From reading Josephus, we also get a sense of what scholar Richard Horsley has called the spiral of violence that was ongoing at the time of the birth of Jesus, at the beginnings of the Jesus movement. We get a sense of political revolutionaries like the Galilean Judas, who around the time of Jesus' birth said that people were cowards if they would endure to pay a tax to the Romans and would, after God, submit to mortals as their lords. Josephus the Jew talks about false prophets who led Jews astray into political rebellion and eventually into war with the Romans.